Welcome to another Telperion tutorial. This time we're going to walk through how to play Warhammer Quest. For anyone stumbling into this video and they find themselves being a purist, none of the pieces or items in this tutorial are going to be original, or they're all just things that I stumbled across that I felt made a fuller game. So don't judge me for not having original things. So in playing Warhammer Quest, you're going to start by picking out a character. And all players are going to pick a character or a number of characters and follow the instructions on how to set up their character. For this tutorial, we're just going to do one character just to keep things simple. So in this case, we're going to do a Dwarf Setup. So what you'll do is you'll take your character card and you'll just follow the instructions on how to set up that character. When it comes to the dwarf, it's just wounds that you have to set up. And so in this case, it's 1d6 plus 8. So that's 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 is the total number of wounds that this character gets to start with. And it helps to write down the starting wounds and then just keep track of as you lose wounds there. So once you've followed all of your characters' kind of setup instructions and you've learned all of their different abilities, and typically there's a front side and then there's a back side, and it gives you a little bit of detail. And so once you're familiar with your character, you can go on to kind of setting up the dungeon itself. Setting up the dungeon involves picking a final room, a boss room, and then creating a dungeon around that final room. So there's going to be a number of different dungeon cards, and to complete setting up the dungeon, you simply take six of the dungeon cards per half of the dungeon. So this is 4, 5, and 6. And then what you do with the boss room is you take that and shuffle it into the one part of the dungeon, not knowing where the final room is going to be. And then you take the other 6 cards and place them on top. This is now your dungeon, and the rest of these cards don't matter for the game that you're playing. So once you've got your dungeon set up, you can start to just play the game. The game has 4 different phases that you're going to play through. You're going to start with what's called the power phase, which involves one of the players taking what's designated as the power die. And so in this case, it's this large purple die with an ouch carved into it. And you roll that die, and it tells you how much power the magic wielders that are playing get to mess with. If there's no magic wielders, then it doesn't do anything other than it's a mechanic in the game. If during the power roll you roll the ouch or you roll a 1, bad things happen. Monsters could come out, traps could get triggered, and we'll get to that in a second. So after you've done your power phase, you go into what's called the warriors phase, where each character, based on their initiative, the higher the initiative, the further forward they get to go. So if you have the highest initiative, you get to go first. And then you look at your move, and you move your character. So in this case, the dwarf gets to move 4. So 1, 2, 3, and I find myself at a door. The rest of the characters would move themselves based on where they wanted to be or what they wanted to do, and that completes the warriors phase because there's no monsters on the board. We then go into the monsters phase, and seeing as there's no monsters on the board, we go into the final phase, which is the exploration phase, where we take the top card of the dungeon deck and flip it over. What's important to note about this is whenever you find yourself in a room like this, where you've got more than one door available, you'll take the dungeon deck and from the bottom to the top, divvy the cards. So you'll go 1 to one door and 1 to the other. once the deck has been completely split in half by going 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 from the bottom to the top. So in essence, you're going to be 50-50 between the two. And to save time, I'm not going to do that. You go into the exploration phase, which is the last phase of a full round, where if the person wielding the lantern is next to a door that's not been opened, they can flip over the top card of the dungeon door in front of them, and that will tell them what room comes next. So in this case, it would have been a corridor. But let's say that it was something like a dungeon room instead. And we find ourselves in a room that that's not just a regular hallway or some kind of corridor, but instead it's a dungeon room. It's listed as a dungeon room on the card. We know going into that room that there's going to be something in the room. Starting at the top of the round, you're going to have another power phase where you take the die and you roll it. And as long as you don't roll a 1, nothing happens to you where you're at. And then we do the monsters phase. We do the heroes phase, where each character, based on their initiative, is going to move their movement. So in this case, 4. And once they're in the place that they want to be in, whatever's on this card jumps out and surrounds the heroes. So in this case, it would have been an event, and you would read the text on the event card, and it would tell you what would happen to the heroes in that room. Other cards are going to have monsters on them, and the monsters are going to have stats, just like the heroes, and they're going to have special text that you have to follow. But the way that the monsters function in the game is they get evenly distributed based on the number of them. And so if there's just one, you'll reach into a bag and you'll pull out a warrior's counter. That'll determine who gets stuck with the one bad guy. If there's multiple, then you'll evenly distribute them amongst the number of heroes that are on the board. So in this case, we just have one hero, and that one hero is going to get a number of different bad guys. Now, all of this has all taken place during the warriors phase. So now I'm out of movement with my warrior. I can't move anymore, but I can still use my attacks during the warriors phase. So when it comes to attacks, you'll look at your character, and it'll tell you what kind of weapon that you have. It'll say, in this case, I have an axe, which causes 1d6 plus 3 damage. So the way that combat works is you decide which enemy you're going to attack. And then you go down to your character sheet, and it's going to tell you what your weapon skill is. So in this case, weapon skill 4. Then you're going to go over to this chart, and it's going to have attacker's weapon skill and defender's weapon skill. So we're going to go attacker weapon skill 4, and then based on the monster that's in front of me, which in this case is 2, you're going to go 4 over to 2, and on a 3 or more, my hero is going to successfully hit this bad guy that's in front of them. So I have one attack, and I'm going to roll one die for my one attack and try and get a 3 or better. I don't. But if I did, let's say I successfully hit the enemy, I would then follow the weapon for how much damage I do, which for my axe is 1d6 plus 3 damage. So I roll again, so 2 plus 3, so if that's 5. Then what you'll do is you'll take that 5 and you'll subtract it with the defense of the toughness of the monster that you're facing. So in this case, they have a toughness of 2. So we'll have 5 being the number that we rolled, 2, plus the additional damage, 3 for the axe. That's 5. Minus 2 toughness brings us to 3 total damage. This particular monster only has 2 health. So if I had, let's say, played through that scenario and I successfully killed an enemy with 1 hit, that's what's called a death blow. A death blow gives you the ability to continue your attack to the next available square, which does not include skipping a square. So, for instance, if this square was full and this square was empty, but this square was full, I could not death blow. But because I have someone in the adjacent next square, I get to do a death blow, which is just going through that same combat sequence again. So, to go through it again, you go to the chart and you determine what you have to roll in order to hit the enemy. So in this case, it was 3. I roll a d6. If I rolled a 3, I would succeed in hitting and I would see how much damage I do. But in this case, somehow I managed to roll a 2 again, which means I didn't hit him and the attack stops right there. After all of the heroes have finished their attacks, they've used all of their attacks, they've dealt all of their damage, what we'll do is we'll move then into the monsters phase, where, again, as I said with the card that I addressed earlier, they have the same exact stats as a hero. So they'll move and they'll attack, and they'll try to attack you based on their weapon skill against your weapon skill, and they'll roll to see if they hit, and then they roll to see how much damage they do. And once all of the monsters on the board have attacked, then you go back to what's called the exploration phase, which is where normally you would get to open a door. But if there's any bad guys that are on the board section that you're on, you can't open the next door. So until all of the enemies have been removed, you can't go into the next room. So then you go back up to the top of the round and you roll the power die again. And as long as you don't roll a 1, no additional bad things happen to you. After you have your power roll, you go into your heroes phase, and they move and they attack, and then the monsters phase where they move and they attack. So during the heroes phase, it's important to recognize that if you're ever adjacent to or move into adjacency with a bad guy, you are what's called pinned. So in order to not be pinned, you have to break from pinning, which involves going over to your character sheet, and that's going to tell you exactly what you have to do in order to break from pinning. So pinning breaks from pinning on a roll of 5 or more. So in this case, let's say I wanted to break away from this combat. I would take a die, I would roll it, and on a 5 or more, I would get to break away. And anything less than that, I wouldn't be allowed to break away, and I would just have to fight where I am. As soon as the heroes have managed to fight their way through the dungeon, past all of the enemies, into the final objective room of what they're trying to do, in this case, it would have been the idol chamber, they face the enemies that are in the final boss room and collect the reward. The end of the game is having completed the final objective room and the enemies that are in it and getting out alive. The sequence of play is as simple as those 4 phases. There's the power phase where you roll for power, the warriors phase where they move and attack, the monsters phase where the monsters move and attack, and then the exploration phase where you see whether or not you get to go into the next room. It's important to recognize that each individual hero in Warhammer Quest is unique, and in order to go through each of them would take hours. And so it really comes down to looking at your character card and knowing exactly what your character does and how it functions. And so if you're a magic character and you've got spells that you need to run through, then that's something that you need to know how that works. But in a general sense, this is how Warhammer Quest plays in less than 15 minutes. And if you're in my game group, then if you have any other questions, you can always just bring them to the table.